One question that I'd like to sort of pose right now to Barry is whether or not, in fact, we are indeed already in a state of power competition, and that the US is very much preoccupied with reasserting itself as the ringleader and the ring holder. So could you kind of, Barry, give us some sense about why you assert the sort of the status quo is unsustainable and without a revitalized bargain to give the US its dominant place? And what do you see as the pressures on the current status quo and whether or not they're likely to, whether it can hold?
Okay, well, the first bit of that is an easy answer, which is, of course, if you're an IR specialist of any kind, the status quo is always unsustainable. Right? I mean, when has any status quo lasted forever? So it's just a question of how long is it going to change, and what will eventually blow up. I think in Northeast Asia there are a lot of fairly obvious variables. I mean, for example, the situation on the Korean Peninsula could blow up at any time or not. I think both China and the US are also quite unpredictable at the moment. That they don't have stable foreign policies, and therefore there can be, and both of their foreign policies are very much driven by rather febrile domestic political factors, and therefore they could change as well. China, of course, is a rising power, and therefore in and of itself is a kind of challenge to the status quo. And the US is declining relatively, and therefore that in itself puts tension on the status quo. But more than that, there's the question, which is implicit in the scenarios in some respects, that China, like Japan before it, as I mentioned, is seeking primacy in East Asia and has a somewhat expansive view of its so-called reunification project, sort of including Taiwan and the islands and reefs in the South China Sea and aspects of the Indian border. So that there are a lot of things in that which could destabilize the status quo if pushed too far. It's not clear that the domestic politics of either country is stable. I mean, in the US, of course, we've had the alarming experience of 4 years of a Trump administration, which basically spent its time attacking everything that the US has stood for the last half century. And doing so quite successfully. So Trump, whatever else you might say about him, he very successfully burned a great deal of America's global social capital. Right? And that isn't coming back soon. And although the rest of the world may have breathed a sigh of relief at the coming of the Biden administration, they are all still thinking, yes, but what happens in 2 years at the next election? What happens in 4 years at the next election? In other words, nobody can any longer take for granted that the United States stands for the particular liberal vision of things that you could reliably say it stood for, whether you liked it or not, but it was at least reasonably consistent since the end of the Second World War. We have now one of the political parties in the United States is basically no longer a democratic party, in the sense it doesn't believe that the electoral system works and is doing its best to restrict the franchise. The big lie is out and about and very effective in American politics. So American politics is quite unpredictable, and therefore one could see U-turns or at least instabilities, which makes it difficult to predict a kind of continuous American policy in the region. At the moment, sure, it looks like a reassertion of American ring holding with a considerable drift, as you were suggesting at the beginning, towards basically power rivalry in the region. But you can't count on that. I think to some extent the same is true in China. I mean, at the moment, it looks as if we have a Chinese government that wants to stay there forever, and it looks as if that government is going to pursue an increasingly hard line, both domestically and internationally. But the Chinese famously say about themselves that everything is continuously changing in China, and it's not clear that Xi Jinping's position is absolutely permanent and absolutely stable. We just don't know how long he's going to last. There's a lot of opposition to him, which is effectively suppressed at the moment. But I don't think you can take for granted that the present line in Chinese politics is going to go on and on. So within the region and between the major players, there are a lot of things that are uncertain, unstable, and could change the elements of the status quo. I think kind of pulling back a bit and looking at the bigger picture, the other thing which is going to make the status quo unsustainable is climate change. It's a little difficult to say exactly when that particular crisis is going to hit in a big enough form to change people's behavior and to change people's outlook. And it's even more difficult to say whether it will change their relations towards more conflictual or more cooperative. It is a shared fate threat about which individual countries can do relatively little. But between the US and China, the two of them together could do a lot. So it is an avenue for potential cooperation between them. And how big does the crisis have to get? Every year we get more and more extreme reports of extreme weather and changes in monsoon cycles and sea level rise and flooding and so on and so forth. Flooding of New Orleans wasn't enough. Any number of dead people in Bangladesh is not enough. What does it take? Right? What's the kind of titanic moment where some big event happens that changes people's minds? It may not be all that far down the line, and that would potentially make a significant difference to the status quo that we're looking at. I'm a bit gloomy on this one. I mean, what I'm seeing is Cold War II coming along. If you ask me to bet on the matter, I would say 2020 will go down as the year in which opinions about China in most of the West changed. The Americans always wanted to construct China as a threat, so there's been a certain continuity in American, indeed, you might even say it's almost the only thing Americans agree on amongst themselves now is that they think that China is a problem and a threat. And that's one of the reasons why it's so continuous between the Trump and Biden administrations, because it's there as a kind of one of the very few points of consensus in American politics. But it seems to me that Hong Kong was perhaps the symbolic moment when China openly and ruthlessly crushed a democracy movement and in a sense broke international agreements about that, regardless of whether you think it was justified in doing so or not. That was a symbolic moment, right? So that many of the countries in the West, I mean Europe in particular, which had been more or less content to rub along with China, seeking economic relations with it and all that, and kind of being prepared to sit on the fence about most of the political issues, they changed their minds now, I think, so that the Chinese have, as it were, helped out the US by pushing the rest of Western opinion more towards the American position that China is a threat and a problem and that we need to do things about that. So now, British and French aircraft carriers are sailing around in the South China Sea and all that. And the Quad is looking a bit more alliance-like than it did before. So maybe 2020 was the year in which the balance tipped on that, and that if we get, as I think we are getting, if we get the kind of great power rivalry default scenario, and that it takes the form of a Cold War between the West and various others, and China and probably Russia on the other side, that might look like the starting point of it.